Welcome. You've reached Christian-Apologist.com, and I'm really excited today to be here with Andrew and with Joshua, and we're going to have a mock debate on some of the really tough questions that atheists have asked us.
All I have to say to that is... Alright, before we jump into an ice-cold lake of crazy, the video I'm responding to is about an hour and a half long. I've cut out big portions of it, but I encourage you to go watch the original for yourself. As always, the link is in the description box. Some of the clips I used from the original video are a bit long. I rarely reply to live streams because they're often rambly, stray off topic, and are hard to respond to, but I'm making an exception this time around. I wanted to include enough of the answers given that I couldn't be accused of taking someone out of context. With all that said, let's jump into the video.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a really hard question, and this is the one that I think actually of all of the atheist arguments is probably the strongest one, and it's, if there is an omnibenevolent God, why is there evil in the world? And let me actually phrase a question that Anastasia Polikakos said. She said, there are instances of unnecessary suffering that nobody hears about. So there is no greater good that couldn't be obtained by that suffering. And she uses the example of a person who's sexually assaulted and abused and tortured and abducted and killed, and no one hears about exactly what happens in that particular instance. So she says, in that case, then there must not be a greater good. So how would you respond to that?
It's a good question. It's even better when you add in the idea that this God isn't only all good, but is all-knowing and all-powerful. These concepts together create a whole different conversation, because a God that is all good but fallible can make mistakes. If this God's power is limited, there may be things it cannot do. So, even if its intentions are always the best, or could be described as being all good, it could be tricked, be thwarted by unforeseen circumstances, or be limited in some way by its power, and you could end up with a scenario that most people would look at and say, yeah, that's not a good outcome. Anyway, carry on.
I'll take the hard-ass position. The hard-ass position is... there are no true evils except moral evil, right? And the fact that you suffer and are raped is not an evil to you. It's suffering, yes, but the fact that these horrible things happen to me or you isn't in itself an evil, right? The evil is the intention of the actor who engaged in evil against you.
Okay, so imagine I'm standing in a room. In front of me is a man who's about to sexually assault, beat, and kill a woman. I have the power to stop this from happening. I also know that it will happen long before it actually happens, and people describe me as being the best example of a good person they have ever met. I stand there and watch the woman get raped, tortured, and I know, eventually killed, while she stares into my eyes pleading for help. I do nothing. Finally, I cross my arms and explain to the woman that the man doing these things to her has free will. Her will doesn't matter. Just because she's suffering tremendously, isn't it evil to her? It's not in itself a moral evil. I tell her that this unimaginably brutal scenario has to play out, and once again I go back to doing nothing to intervene. I doubt anyone in their right mind would call me a good person, let alone all good. In God's case, you have an entity that has all knowledge and all power, making it even easier to see that such a being would be indescribably gross and unethical to sit by and do nothing.
And like I said, this is sort of the hard-ass position, right? That the suffering in the world isn't a moral evil, right? And moral evils are what are logically the things that are logically difficult in the problem of evil.
If your God is responsible for everything and knows what the outcomes will be before we're even born, then it is ultimately, at the very least, partially responsible for the outcome. If God has a grand plan and everything happens according to that plan, then it is also on the hook for the moral evil that takes place. It literally willed that evil to happen, for crying out loud.
And so if we look at it this way, we're asking, well, why do we permit this horrible person of kidnapping you and torturing you and doing all these horrible things? Why does God permit it? And the answer is that God has given within you the moral choice of whether or not you will commit evil. And in the same choice exists in this person who is committing evil, but they're misusing it and choosing to go away from goodness to evil, right?
Right? Wrong.
Okay, so the person committing the evil has made the choice to carry out an evil act, but the victim has no choice, and yet their free will is being violated. They're not choosing to be raped and tortured. Why exactly would this all-good being prioritize the free will of the evil actor over the victim? And given that this being has all power and all knowledge, why would it even require the evil to happen? It would simply know the outcome and could save the victim the suffering that would have been visited upon them. Hell, this being could even set up a sort of hologram unit if the evil actor must physically or mentally carry out the act for it to count. And once they act out the scenario on what they should think was a real, living, breathing victim, this god could whisk them off to the appropriate place for punishment, or whatever, thus saving another conscious entity from suffering.
So that brings us to a question that I've been asked on based on this same exact issue. Now, what if this criminal is someone like a Jeffrey Dahmer, who at the very end of his life, right before he's about to be executed, or actually I think he was killed in prison, but right before that, he decides that he's a Christian. Does he get to go to heaven?
Of course he does. Everyone gets to go to heaven.
And that if you come to heaven and you're all messy from your sins, there's going to be a cleaning process. And
Looks like someone took a big bloody dump all over my new
Soul.
but it's no match for the...
God.
See? Look at that.
and you're going to get scrubbed to be made clean. And some of this is going to be actions that you're going to take, probably prayer, to try to make those things right that you did wrong.
So Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, who committed the rape, murder, and dismemberment of at least 17 men and boys, will have to pray his soul clean? That sounds legit.
But how is that little boy going to feel if he sees Jeffrey Dahmer in heaven, the little boy he abducted and killed?
Oh, well, if the boy is in heaven, he will see any goodness. He will see the goodness in Jeffrey Dahmer fully actualized and fully done, right? Because I'm sure that Jeffrey Dahmer looked maybe innocent or good to some moment to that little boy, and that little moment will be what is fulfilled in all of the being of Jeffrey Dahmer, assuming that he's gone through the purgatorial process.
Maybe you're talking about this young boy who was 14 years old when Jeffrey lured him to his apartment and drilled a hole in his skull so that he could inject hydrochloric acid into his brain. I'm sure he looked innocent or good at some moment, Andrew. Do you hear what you're saying?
So why does God give infinite punishment for finite crimes?
Yeah, I would say it's our choice where we end up. This is, as y'all know, this is what C.S. Lewis said. We have a responsibility. This isn't just a mere game. And when you think of it like that, you know that the ramifications are so important, how we treat others.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Master Apologist Joshua. Like, when you told Shannon Q that you won't debate girls? Or when you told her you wanted her to beg for the privilege of debating you? Or wait, maybe you were worrying long and hard about how you should treat others, when you suggested that atheists were just now learning how to read. No, it was definitely when you wondered out loud whether or not atheists should be enslaved. Forgive me if I don't buy what you're trying to sell here.
Well, I'm glad you brought up U.S. history, because that reminds me of another argument that I want to make, and that's slavery. Why did Jesus not outlaw slavery? And we saw it in the Bible. If we go back to Deuteronomy, we can see all of these examples of slavery. So I think that if it were a perfect God, he would have outlawed slavery. No one should own another human.
I agree. He spent a lot of time worrying about graven images and people worshiping the wrong God, but spent no time saying we shouldn't own other human beings. How do you explain this, Master Apologists?
One, if we look at what biblical and classical slavery is, right, and compare it to like American chattel slavery. American chattel slavery was far more evil and egregious than anything the Greeks or Romans did or the Jews did, right?
And that matters why. Is slavery evil? If so, why is God not telling people not to do it?
So that's one thing to keep in mind, is when we're looking at what biblical slavery was, it was something that was typical and more akin to something like typical at the time and more akin to debt slavery, right? And if we look at debt slavery and employment and the ways that we engage in servitude, we still have servitude in the modern world. The fundamentally, most people are in servitude in the West and everywhere, right? That oftentimes we have a mortgage or student debt. We have an employer that salaries us, which is actually the way that many slaves in antiquity were engaged in.
That is complete and utter nonsense, but since I'm no expert on the Middle East, I asked Digital Hammurabi if they could help me out with this point. If you enjoy history, please check out their channel, linked in the description box below. Take it away, Joshua.
I'm often asked about the topic of slavery, both in the Old Testament and in the ancient Near East. Was there slavery? What was slavery like? Should we even refer to people as slaves, or should we call them servants? Of course, biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholars have dedicated countless papers, articles, and monographs to the topic of ancient law, including identifying and describing slavery in the Bible and in the ancient world. Given the complexities involved in identifying ancient social and legal practices, including slavery, I will try to limit my brief comments to slavery in the Old Testament, identifying only those aspects that are generally agreed upon in the academic community. There are primarily two types of slaves described in the Hebrew Bible: Hebrew slaves and foreign slaves. An Israelite would generally become a slave by selling themselves into slavery, or debt slavery, although there were times that they could be purchased or even be born into slavery. Foreign slaves were often acquired as spoil or plunder during war, but they also could be purchased or born into slavery. Several passages are often referenced in the discussion of slavery in the Hebrew Bible: Exodus 21, Leviticus 25, and Deuteronomy chapters 20 and 21. As an aside, the complexity of the creation of these texts, as well as their editorial history and redaction, should be kept in mind during this discussion. In general, Israelites that fell into poverty and became debt slaves were treated as hired servants. They were not to be treated ruthlessly, as we see in Leviticus 25. There are several ways that Hebrew slaves could be released from their debt slavery. They could buy their way out, they could be redeemed by a kinsman, or they would be released after 6 years or during the year of Jubilee. We see this in Exodus 21 and in Leviticus 25. These laws did not apply to foreign slaves, as they were able to be kept and handed down as inherited property, as we see in Leviticus 25, 44 to 46. Given the status of slaves as property, they could be beaten, even severely, as we see in Exodus 21. However, if a slave were killed as the immediate and direct result of their discipline, they would be avenged, a term that is of course debated as to its precise meaning among scholars. In addition, if the master were to put out an eye or a tooth, the slave was to be set free. Of course, this is only a broad survey of slavery in the Hebrew Bible. For further detail on slavery in the Old Testament, as well as in the wider Near East, see the book History of Ancient Near Eastern Law, edited by Raymond Westbrook, and Debt Slavery in Israel and the Ancient Near East by Gregory Kirikingyo.
Thanks again, Joshua, for that clip. I also wanted to add that in Exodus, we see that if the slave master gave his slave a wife, when it came time for him to go free, the slave master would be entitled to keep his wife and children. To compare this to modern careers is bloody ludicrous. Having a mortgage or a student debt is nothing like having your family ripped from you or being beaten on a whim. Honestly, this is what religion often reduces you to: apologizing, excusing, and minimizing horrifically barbaric acts like slavery, etc.
And if you notice, in the Jewish law, you're not allowed to kill a slave. You can engage in harsh punishment, but you're also allowed to engage in harsh punishment against your children.
So you're allowed to beat your children as well. Sounds like you're pointing out another instance where the Bible was wrong. That's my job. Stop doing it for me, Andrew.
The knowledge that the people of the Old Testament had was a limited knowledge, and God was accommodating himself to the language and the cultural concepts and the milieu that they found themselves in. They did the best that they could, but they grew from that. And we are a product of that today. It's theology that got us out of that.
Master Apologist, sorry to interrupt, but we're not talking about the people. We're talking about your deity. Your God would have the knowledge that slavery was wrong. That's the bloody point. While our ethics evolve, your gods should not. And why would your God need to accommodate himself to human beings? He doesn't seem to have any issue commanding all sorts of other things of his people, which the people at that time, at least some of them anyway, wanted to engage in. He didn't just accommodate himself there. Why did he do so with slavery?
You're an atheist just like me. We're just an atheist over one God that you believe in one God. I believe that all 3,000 are not true.
Some of my preparation for the debate, I already knew. I mean, I've already seen and studied a lot of this. Of course, we can always study more. Got to always be humble. But
yeah, we all know how humble you are.
But we all believe in gods today. The atheist believes in gods.
I love how this guy just finished saying he should always be humble right before telling atheists what they believe. This guy has zero self-awareness.
The god of Mars, the god of power, the god of mammon, all is about money. Said Marx, in the god of Aphrodite, the god of sexual pleasure. And that was what Freud said, and others. So we can't get away from the gods.
Yeah, we can. None of those are gods. If you're going to redefine gods to mean anything that we might value, you've stripped the word of pretty much any meaning. It's like you just shuffled some papers, chose a bunch of random concepts, and flung them out of your face in projectile vomit mode. It looked fun. Let me give it a whirl. The god of ice cream. The god of video games. The god of butt plugs. The god of suits and ties. Man, I can see why you find it so addictive.
How would you feel if you're in heaven and you know your child is burning in hell? I think that's sort of the gist of what I'm seeing here from Brian. And another question is, why would God even allow other religions to exist in the world?
So there are a couple things that we have to answer, right? That one is, if I have reached this most blessed state, I have full unity with God. So that means that I have all the knowledge that God has.
We are the religious. Lower your skepticism and surrender your brain. We will add your biological and metaphysical distinctiveness to our own. You will adapt to serve God. You will be added to the collective consciousness. Resistance is futile.
So I know exactly the details of the orientation of my child's spirit and the details of what's occurring to them, right? And the other thing is, we know exactly what God is. God is just. And so insofar as the damned child is experiencing hell, they are getting exactly their just desserts. And so how does a parent feel when they see their child get exactly what they deserve?
Just when you didn't think it could get any worse, Andrew defends the torture of not only children, but possibly his own child. And you thought this was the lowest these two master apologists could sink, but you'd be oh so wrong.
I mean, that's fundamentally the question, right? And if they're a good parent, they should want their child to get what they deserve, right?
Not only does he defend the torture of children, but tells you that you should want your child tortured by God if you're a good parent. I often get told that I'm too harsh on religion, but it's crap like this that makes me think I should be harder. This guy is so twisted up inside because of his superstitious, barbaric religious beliefs that he'd smile and be thankful that his child was screaming in agony below him. In fact, he'd be intimately connected to the process if he knew everything that his God knew. Oof, like, oh my. I don't even know what to say at this point. It's just so gross.
Well, do you believe in a literal lake of fire?
Well, I mean...
Because that means your child is going to be burning. That's what the atheists would say.
Yeah, well, true, but
I don't...
That's the thing, though, is I would also know that that's what they deserve, right?
Can I ask y'all one? A really sophisticated atheist question.
Sure.
Okay. an atheist walks into a sandwich shop, and he's not allowed to get his favorite ham and cheese sandwich, and then proclaims that his suffering shows that God does not exist because God did not give him the sandwich. How would you reply to that sophisticated argument?
A really sophisticated atheist question that no atheist would ever ask seriously. An atheist walks into a sandwich shop. He's met at the counter by the owner. He asks for a sandwich because he's heard the owner is the wisest, nicest, most caring sandwich shop owner in town. The sandwich shop owner demands that the atheist believe in an invisible, lazy-eyed pink dragon beast sandwich. He tells the atheist that he won't be able to in any way detect the sandwich, but he must still pay the owner $100 every week for the rest of his life. The sandwich is that freaking amazing. The atheist refuses. The owner promptly jumps over the counter and begins to beat and torture the customer because he didn't believe in the invisible sandwich. The customer cries out to any passerby that this owner is not the wisest, nicest, most caring sandwich shop owner in town. A pompous ass who goes by the handle Master Sandwich Shop Owner Apologist yells back at the broken and bleeding man that, of course he's the wisest, nicest, most caring sandwich shop owner in town. After all, it was his choice to buy his sandwich there, and if he'd only bought the invisible pink dragon beast sandwich, he'd be in great shape right now. Anyhow, that's all I can take. I watched an hour and a half so you wouldn't have to. Thanks for watching, take care, and cheers.
I've been with you since God knows when. You pick me up at the club and then you take me home, invite me in. The lights go down and we begin.